Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to join us tonight. My name is Arjorie Arbery-Barabo, and I'm the West Eugene Community Organizer for Beyond Toxics. And I want to thank you all again for being here with us tonight. And I'm going to turn over the introduction to Lisa. You're on mute, Lisa.
Okay, my name is Lisa Arkin. I'm Executive Director of Beyond Toxics, and we're excited to have you here tonight. We can go to the next slide, I think. Just to tell you a little bit about Beyond Toxics, we have a long history of helping communities with air quality concerns. And that's what we're doing here tonight, is reviewing an air permit with you and telling you as much as we know about it at this point and answering your questions. And I want to introduce our other team members. You already met Arjorie, our West Eugene Environmental Justice Organizer. I'd like to introduce Taryn Yazdani, Beyond Toxics Staff Attorney and Climate Justice Policy Manager. We also have Mason Levitt with us, who is our GIS spatial data extraordinaire person with us. And on the back, we have other staff members, John Jordan Cascade and Crystal Abrams with us tonight. And I'm going to hand it right back to Arjorie, who's going to tell us a little bit about Beyond Toxics and sort of the rules of the Zoom meeting tonight. Thank you, Arjorie.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lisa. Again, we are Beyond Toxics, and I would like to tell you who we are. Beyond Toxics uplifts voices from Oregon communities disproportionately impacted by pollution and climate change. We collaborate with other nonprofits, educators, and tribal organizations to build a movement to demand that state and local policies require fair, inclusive, and equitable access to clean air, clean water, and safe spaces for all to live and work in. Through grassroots organizing and education, we support the rise of youth and other diverse communities in becoming the central environmental justice leaders of our state. So that's who we are. That's who Beyond Toxics is. And why are we here? What are we doing here tonight? So again, thank you all for joining us. We're here to help folks understand the Seneca Title V permit, what their aim is for renewing their permit, and how we are working hard along with the Eugene City Council and the community to help put policies in place that will help protect us from new and existing facilities here in West Eugene. During this meeting, we will share a lot of information with you. We will also give you ways, share ideas with you on how to get involved in the decision-making processes that need to be put in place to protect us from any facilities causing further harm in our community. Some of you may have Zoom experience with COVID and all the Zoom rooms. Some of you may have experience with that. And if you do, that's great, but give me just a second to explain some of the rules here to folks that don't have that experience with Zoom. So in general, we can have the function on in the chat. Generally speaking, you can put your question or your comment in the chat, but because we're giving you so much information tonight, we will not enable that particular function until after our presentations. So please, if you have a question, write it down so that you don't forget, and we will try to answer that question for you to the best of our ability at the end of our presentations. This meeting is being recorded, as you heard at the start. But we're only recording the presentation part because we want to allow time for the Q&A for folks to feel like they can ask questions and talk about their concerns candidly. So you will be muted, and at the Q&A portion of this presentation, then we will unmute you and you can put your questions in the chat or you can raise your hand. And again, we will try to answer those questions to the best of our ability. Lisa, I would like to turn it over to you to get this shindig going.
Thanks, Arjorie. So first thing we want to talk about are the new owners of the Seneca Sustainable Energy or Cogen plant, and also the new owners of the Seneca Sawmill. So back in 2021, a year ago, Seneca was bought out by Sierra Pacific. And they're not your mom and pop shop. And we thought this was important to bring up because in the public hearing that LRAPA held, a lot of people were talking about how Seneca is a local company and they've been in the community for such a long time. Well, they are no longer the owners, and we have a very large corporation, Sierra Pacific Industries. It's owned by Red Emerson. And they purchased both the Eugene and the Notai sawmill along with the Cogen plant. They're known for aggressive business practices. They've been written up in a number of magazines, and they need to have pretty aggressive business practices to support their very large land holdings. They're the biggest landowner in California of forest land. And they also have to satisfy their shareholders. So it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us that these new owners, Sierra Pacific Industries, requested new air quality permits that will allow increases both in air pollution, but also an increase in production, especially at the sawmill. Sierra Pacific Industries is the second largest lumber producer in the United States. Their offices are located in Anderson, California, and they manage 1.9 million acres of timberland there. So just as a starting place, we're getting used to the new business in town. And now I'm going to hand it off to Taryn, who's going to start walking us through the air permit. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Thanks so much, Archery, and everyone here today. Nice to meet you all virtually. My name is Taryn Yazdani. So yeah, we'll get started. I am going to be with you on a few very dense slides coming up, so bear with me. So first, we're going to look into what is Seneca Cogen and what does that actually mean. We're going to have a map on the next slide that'll paint a better picture, but I did want to let you guys know that this facility is located within the Eugene UGB, and it is upwind of the Bethel neighborhood. It is also upwind of parts of wards 5, 6, and 7. Now, what does cogen mean? This basically means that this facility uses steam power for two purposes. First, it uses the steam to heat kilns that dry out the lumber. And then that same steam is used to turn turbines for energy production. And the energy production that comes out of this plant is used to both power the sawmill, which is on the same property as you'll see in the upcoming slide, as well as to sell the electricity to EWEB. So it has those kind of dual purposes. In order to make this electricity, the facility is burning woody biomass and byproducts like wood chips and wood shavings, but it's also important to note that this permit also allows the incineration of agricultural waste products like animal bedding and harvest residues, which is things like corn husks, wheat, and leftovers from field crops. So I'll go to this next slide so you can kind of get a better picture of what this looks like geographically. So as you can see, this map was brought to you by our very own Mason. So thank you, Mason, for giving us this map. And the facility, as you can see, shares a property with Seneca Sawmill. The orange is the outline of the sawmill itself, and the yellow is where the cogen facility sits. So you also can see that this yellow line dipping below the cogen facility a bit, I can write about here, is actually a conveyor belt that physically connects the two facilities. Now, these facilities have separate air permits through LRAPA, which I will get into the nitty-gritty and details of what that all means and why they're kind of parsing it up into two separate permits. But they are considered a combined entity when it comes to the emission of hazardous air pollutants, which we'll circle back to in a few minutes as well. So it was just really important for us to show you kind of how, even though these are different permits through LRAPA, these facilities are extremely closely connected. They're intertwined by being co-located on the same property, as well as being owned and operated by Seneca or Sierra Pacific, the same company. And like I mentioned previously, some of the electricity is going to be used to operate the sawmill as well. So that's just a little bit of geographic context. Oh, hello. Okay, so just a quick roadmap of before diving into the nitty gritty and the health impacts, we wanted to give you kind of some background on the facility itself and its permit history. So the facility was built in 2011, and in 2014, it was granted its first Title V air permit. In 2019, it applied for a Title V permit renewal, but at that time, it was also called into Cleaner Air Oregon. And the facility was called into Cleaner Air Oregon mainly because during this time, so Cleaner Air Oregon goes in some phases. I'll do a kind of high level overview, but DEQ developed a prioritized list of Title V facilities in this first round that were kind of the worst of the worst. And again, there are phases to when facilities are called into Cleaner Air Oregon, but the Seneca Cogen facility was in this first round of facilities called in to complete the Cleaner Air Oregon risk assessment. So in 2021, they completed their public health risk assessment, and they kind of checked that off the list of the things they needed to do. It satisfied the Cleaner Air Oregon criteria. And then not 1 year later, they turned around and applied to become a major source and emit more through this new Title V permit, which is kind of where we are right now in the timeline. So the big question is, why is there a new permit? So this is going to be really dense, and so I'll try to be as clear as possible. So as I previously mentioned, the Cogen facility and the Sawmill have these two separate permits through LRAPA, and they are considered separate facilities for air permitting purposes. Seneca Cogen is asking to renew its 5-year Title V permit. And this is due to the emission of criteria pollutants. So this action is because the facility can potentially emit over 100 tons of criteria pollutants per year. And because of that, they'll need an updated permit. So if you're kind of thinking it as why they're parsed out, it's because of criteria pollutants. They are considered together, however, when looking at federal hazardous air pollutants, which are FHAPs or HAPs. And the Cogen facility is considered with the Sawmill together, and they kind of previously have had a combined emissions total of 25 tons per year that they are allowed to emit together. So with this new permitting structure, now all of the limits on the FHAPs will be removed, which basically means that the old 25 tons per year emissions limit for hazardous air pollutants no longer exists. It means that they can emit over that amount and well over, as we'll get into the numbers a bit later, but as the slide says here, between the two facilities, it's now looking like they will have a proposed combined emission of 73.6 tons per year of hazardous air pollutants. We'll get into what hazardous air pollutants are a little bit, but just for some context for you to know right now, hazardous air pollutants are those that have very serious health consequences. They are carcinogens. They can also cause birth defects. So that's kind of what this is. So yes, they are now a major source. And in light of the 25 ton per year maximum being gone, these facilities will now be governed by maximum control technology standards, or MACT standards. So they have no emissions limitation, but these MACT standards will kind of govern their emissions. So what is MACT? MACT standards are basically technology-based standards. And this slide has a lot of dense information, but kind of the main takeaway from this is that these are technology-based. They are set by the industries that are performing the best and the ones that are performing at peak performance. And kind of for context, the Seneca Cogen is a relatively newer facility compared to the other Cogen facilities that are out there. So it's very likely that Seneca will be setting its own MACT standards going forward, which, you know, is just, it's a flag raised. And it's also really important to note that these standards don't have any health-based criteria at all. It's completely based on the best technology available kind of during the whole permitting process by our understanding. So another important thing to notice is that MACT standards are really specific to types of technology. So for this facility, they have boilers and kilns, and those are the two things that will kind of be governed by MACT. So there is theoretically a MACT boiler standard and there are kiln boiler standards. So to kind of give you some context, the operating limitations for the boiler MACT are listed on the slide, but it includes things like having to do yearly stack testing on a facility continually, having more equipment tune-ups, meeting work practice standards, as well as, very site-specific limitations, for example, like keeping the opacity of the emissions coming out of the stacks below 10%. So, and just for some context, this picture that you see on the slide is demonstrating differences in opacity of emissions. When talking about opacity, it comes from the word opaque, which is basically the more you can see through it, the quote unquote better it is. And the more dense the cloud is, the more that is theoretically being emitted. And so if you're keeping it below 10%, if you can, as you can hopefully see on this image, even 25% is quite faint. So theoretically, the 10% would be extremely faint. So yes, and just another thing to know here, the permit states that for compliance, there should be an average of no more than 20% opacity in an hour and 10% opacity on an hourly average. So yeah, that's MACT. It's very dense. So yes. Okay. Thank you for hanging in there. So as promised, I'm going to do a quick review of some of the emissions that we've been throwing around, some of the words that we've been saying, to give you a little bit of context of what we mean. So when we talk about criteria pollutants, that's things like particulate matter, ground level ozone, carbon monoxide, lead, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide. These are basically the 6 most common pollutants that can harm health, the environment, and property. And we're also going to talk about volatile organic compounds, but it's just the note here is that ozone is not typically directly emitted from plants as a pollution emission, but it's formed in the atmosphere by a reaction of oxides of nitrogen and volatile organic compounds. So the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds, play a super pivotal role in creating that criteria pollutant of ground level ozone. Another word that we will be going in depth about, especially when we start talking about some health concerns a little bit later on, are the federal hazardous air pollutants, or the HAPs, or the FHAPs. These are known to cause cancer and serious health impacts, such as birth defects. They're very, very harmful. And these pollutants are, there's really no minimum exposure threshold like criteria pollutants. So yeah, that's just something to note. Again, we'll go a little bit deeper into this, but these are some of the more hazardous carcinogens when we're talking about what will be emitted. And going back to the whole context of why this major source is really important, both the cogen facility and the sawmill together will be emitting over 70 tons of these hazardous air pollutants. So that's very concerning. So particulate matter, which I'm sure you guys have heard of, is a mixture of kind of the solid particles and the liquid droplets in the air. These are things like dust, soot, particulates in smoke or wildfire smoke, kind of haze as well. It's very, you can see it. It's kind of what lands on cars and gets in your lungs. It comes in a bunch of various sizes. It can be as big as 90 micrometers, which for context, as you see in this picture here, is about as large as a grain of fine beach sand, which is not, it's not huge in context, but when you think about particulate 2.5, which is really, really thin, that is, you know, significantly smaller and thinner than a piece of human hair. So we're talking about things that, you know, vary in size, and for the smaller it gets, the more dangerous and harmful it becomes. And the more easily it can enter the human bloodstream and cause a myriad of issues, which we are going to touch on a little later. And then volatile organic compounds, which is the final definition we're going to be going through today. These are volatile, truly, for lack of a better word. They evaporate very easily at room temperature, and they're super reactive to sunlight. They also have really high vapor pressure. It's also really important to note that there kind of is an overlapping Venn diagram when you look at hazardous air pollutants and VOCs. Many VOCs are also considered HAPs, which means that, you know, while this covers a huge category of emissions, a lot of them are extremely toxic, carcinogenic, and harmful to human health. They have a variety of very long and short-term health impacts. And yeah, I will turn it back over to Lisa for a bit. And yeah, I will see you soon. Thank you.
That was great, Taryn. Wonderful introduction. There's so much to share with you, and we're eager to answer your questions. Now I'm going to walk us through kind of a comparison between the current or existing permit for the cogen facility and the Sawmill facility, and then what's being proposed in terms of emission limits in the new permit. Excuse me. So let's start with those federally regulated hazardous air pollutants. In the old permit, the limits for federally regulated hazardous air pollutants for the cogen facility was 24 tons per year. In the new permit, that will be reduced to 11.6 tons per year. So that's a good thing. But remember, the permit is combining both the Sawmill and the cogen plant for hazardous air pollutants, as Taryn explained, because they are now a major source. So they are considered together for this particular class of pollutants. So the Seneca Sawmill used to be permitted at 24 tons of hazardous air pollutants per year. However, in the new permit, they're allowed to go up as high as 62 tons per year. So together, as Taryn mentioned, that's 73.6 tons of very hazardous substances per year coming from this combined source. That's about 3 times more pollution for HAPs than in the previous permits. And so we feel that's a major concern. Moving on to volatile organic compounds. In the old permit, Seneca Cogen was permitted at 39 tons a year, and they're staying at that same level for the current permit. And this is what we call the plant site emission limits, which we'll get into in a moment. So that's their upper limit. They can pollute up to that limit legally, but we'll go back to that in a moment. The Sawmill was permitted at 99 tons per year, but now they're going up to 249 permitted tons per year of volatile organic compounds. Now, I just want to say we're not suggesting that the facilities are permitted as one for volatile organic compounds as they are for hazardous air pollutants. I know it's a lot of letters and numbers, but we feel that the two facilities are contributing to our airshed together. They are co-located, they are co-owned. And so we look at the total allowable combined volatile organic emission limits is 288 tons per year. It's possible in the permits. So let's go on to particulate matter. And thinking back to Taryn's wonderful graphic design of the hair and the sizes of particulate matter, the reason particulate matter is regulated as a criteria air pollutant is because of its danger to our health and to the quality of our air. Technically, coarse particle matter, or just PM, is going up in the Seneca Sawmill permit. But the fine particulate matter, that would be PM10 and PM 2.5, are going down. So you'll see that in this bulleted point here. Seneca Cogen was at 16 tons per year of all particulate matter and 16 for the fine particulate matter. Now they're asking to go up to 24 tons per year for all particulate matter, but for the finest ones, they're suggesting they will go down 2 tons per year, down to 14. The Sawmill was regulated at 49 tons per year, and they're suggesting they will reduce to 24 tons a year. But the big concern is that PM 2.5, the smallest, finest particles that we can breathe in and can impact our respiratory and cardiovascular system. Together, if we add them up, not that they're regulated together, but if we add up their emissions, it increases that fine particulate matter by 4 tons per year. So in the past, Seneca Sawmill has raised their numbers and lowered their numbers and kind of up and down with each permit they've received in the past. And so it's really unclear if there's truly a reduction from 16 tons per year down to 14 tons per year. PM10 and PM 2.5 in this particular, for this particular facility, the Seneca Cogen plant, has been said to, there's a memo we received from LRAPA a while back saying that all the PM10 emission is actually PM 2.5. So you have a lot of very fine particulate matter coming into our air shed. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, how this goes in the future. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is like a screenshot of the review report for the Seneca Cogen facility. It's a busy chart. On the left-hand column, you have the criteria air pollutant. I'll read them really quick. You have PM, which is particulate matter, then PM 10 microns, PM 2.5 microns. CO stands for carbon monoxide, NOx stands for nitrogen oxide, SO2 stands for sulfur dioxide, and VOC stands for volatile organic compounds. This is also a major polluter of greenhouse gases, although they're not regulated in the same way as the criteria air pollutants. So remembering that these are regulated because they're health hazards and reduce the quality of air. So for example, the nitrogen oxides combine with the volatile organic compound to create that ground level ozone, which is a byproduct of all these things and can be an additional harm, hazardous air pollutant, so to speak, in our for our health and for our environment. I want to draw your attention to the 2 columns called plant site emission limit, or PSEL. There you see the previous PSEL, which was in tons per year, and then the newly proposed one for this permit. So I kind of walked you through that in the previous slides. And then notice the column on the far right is PTE, and we have it there in yellow. That stands for potential to emit. So there's a difference between potential to emit and plant site emission limits. And we're going to dive a little deeper by handing it back to Taryn, and she's going to walk us through the difference between those two and why it's important.
Great, thank you so much. So like Lisa said, there is potential to emit, and then there are PSELs that are generic. So to kind of just read you the definitions, so the PTE, the potential to emit, is the emission rate that a facility can actually put out. It's the emissions that are out there given the current state of the facility's technology. And that is what is possible at the time of the permit to kind of go out into the world emission-wise. Now, generic PSELs, or the generic plant site emissions limitations, are generic numbers, and they're based on two things. It's a maximum cap of emissions based on the PTE, as well as the maximum allowable emissions, basically saying that this is a number that is factored in usually far greater than what the PTE actually is, that gives emissions headroom for the facility. And that basically means that since the number of the PSEL is typically much higher than the PTE, that gives the facility the wiggle room to increase its emissions without triggering the Clean Air Act, without needing a new permit, and without being in violation of anything. So it is basically a way to say that if in the event the facility makes a physical or operational change that allows it to emit more, it could emit up to that generic PSEL number. So it's kind of a loophole, a gap, a way for facilities to emit more without having a slap on the wrist. It's currently legal for a polluter to emit all the way up to the generic PSEL. And going back to that example that we just saw in the permit for particulate matter, the PSEL for Seneca Cogen's particulate matter is up to 24. And that means that the PTE for this is only 11. However, if Seneca in between or in the span of this 5-year Title V permit decides to make an operational or physical change, it can emit up to 24 tons per year of particulate matter without getting dinged or needing a new Title V permit. So that is why those numbers are so important. That is why when we are kind of going through this, we are looking at the generic PSEL and the plant site emissions, because while, you know, LRAPA is saying that they only have the potential to emit 11, they're still very legally able to emit up to whatever number is in the proposed column. So that's why it's so important. It's also really important to note that DEQ recognizes that this is a huge issue. It's a problem that DEQ is currently addressing. They are in the process of undergoing a rulemaking that kind of throws generic PSELs out the window. And it's saying for PSELs going forward, these either need to be set at the facility's potential to emit or at a capacity to emit. So it gets rid of the larger generic numbers and kind of reins the emissions in a bit. It is also really important to note that the DEQ rulemaking process is not finalized, it's not done. The permit for Seneca Cogen's Title V will be finalized well before the rulemaking is. So legally, they're not doing anything wrong by including the generic PSELs, but you know, it's just a fact that DEQ will no longer allow that going forward. So the permit is just going to be pushed through to kind of allow the possible highest of the high emissions. And yeah, that's just kind of timeline wise where this is falling, unfortunately. But I will send it back to Lisa.
Yes, we would prefer that this permit process had been delayed until DEQ finishes that rulemaking, but that's not the timeline that LRAPA is following. The next series of graphs and tables were made by our GIS and spatial data coordinator, Mason. So we're really grateful to him for doing that. And it's going to look at the pollution emitted just by the cogen facility. So, you know, we always want to know which way is the wind blowing and how are these pollutants traveling through the air. So Mason created these arrows to show the predominant wind direction during most of the year, which is heading from the north kind of down to the south and to the southeast and southwest. And as Taryn already mentioned, that would be wards 5, 6, and 7 primarily. Bethel and the facilities on the other side of the Northwest. I mean, not facilities, the residences on the other side of the Northwest Expressway. There are different ways that these pollutants can impact us through our body. And what Mason did is look at each pollutant from the cogen facility and determine whether it was likely to cause exposure through ingestion, breathing, drinking, or contact with soil. So you can see how many pollutants fall into all of those exposure categories as they travel through the air. And of course, air accounts for 72 out of 73 of the air emissions from this facility. Food is not likely an enormous concern from exposures unless it's heavy metals that are falling out and people have gardens that are nearby. Okay, I'll go to the next slide, please. So of the volatile organic compounds, of the hazardous air pollutants, and the other things coming out of the cogen facility, here we show you how many of them are considered known, probable, or suspected carcinogens, or maybe even worse, that no one has done enough research to determine the carcinogeneity of these chemicals. That would be the graph on the right. And on the left, we can see which organ systems these chemicals can affect. Don't forget, some of them are heavy metals. There's also dioxins, as well as the volatile organic compounds and the hazardous air pollutions. Mason did this research for the chemicals for the US Agency on Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and also the EPA. And 5 of the chemicals coming from this facility were not listed on those websites that he could find. Now, one chemical can impact more than one organ system, like particulate matter can cause respiratory illness and distress, as well as harm to our cardiovascular system, meaning it can cause strokes and heart attack and heart disease. So keep that in mind as well. The majority of these emissions impact our respiratory system, our throat, our lungs, and that happens because as we breathe in that fine particulate, the other chemicals actually adhere to those tiny bumpy particles, kind of like if you can imagine a golf ball with all the little divots in it and then kind of mud and dirt on it. It adheres to the bumpy surface. We breathe it in. It's so tiny that it goes very, very deep into our lungs, down to the very smallest areas of our lungs, the alveoli. And there, these fine, tiny particles that are coated with toxic chemicals actually can pass through the lung wall, the thin lung wall, and go directly into our bloodstream. So when it's in our lungs, it can cause shortness of breath, wheezing, coughing, chest pain, fatigue. It can result in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or asthma. But when it passes through there and goes into our bloodstream, then it can turn into a cardiovascular toxicant. And as I mentioned, cause heart disease, stroke, and heart attack. Morbidity increases in a population that is exposed to a lot of fine particulate matter. Also, we talked about how these chemicals can combine in the air under sunlight, causing ground level ozone. That's a big concern, because ozone can also have similar impacts on our health, causing wheezing and shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, fatigue, emphysema. And so, again, this permit process is really about whether or not we're protecting our health. We just have to keep going back to the fact that these are regulated pollutants for a reason, and this is the reason. And it's just, it's distressing to know that, as Taryn was explaining, that MACT standards, for those for those hazardous air pollutants do not have health criteria built into them. So that's a gap in our whole regulatory system there. Okay, let's move on. And there we just wanted to show you what some of those FHAPs are that are in the permit and how many pounds are emitted per year. All those pounds add up to tons. And I won't walk you through this. You might just take a minute to look at it. But for example, benzene is a known carcinogen. It is directly related to childhood leukemia and other blood cancers. But anyway, I'll just let you sit with this for a moment here. We just took the top 8. These are not all the hazardous air pollutants that are coming from these facilities. Let's go to the next slide. And so, you know, backing up and sort of looking at what's coming into the West Eugene airshed and which direction is the wind blowing, we have to think about the cumulative impact of all these chemicals mixing in our air and how they may cause exposures to our families, friends, relatives, community, etc. They're mixing in the air. They're mixing and creating synergistic effects, like as in ground level ozone, or they're just combining in a cumulative fashion, building in our environment, building in our bodies. And yet we really don't have a way to regulate for that. Under Clean Air Oregon, Portland was able to be given a pilot program that will look at cumulative effects of these chemicals on public health, but that program is not available to us in Lane County. They can cause acute health effects or chronic health effects. And very little is known about how these chemicals mix in the air and how they impact us in a cumulative way. The vast majority of these toxic polluters that are represented by the blue dots there are wood refining and wood treatment facilities. I'm going to hand it back to Taryn, and we're coming up on the takeaways.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. So I know we just threw a lot of very dense and concerning information your way. So here's the portion where what can you do to help? Your testimony would be amazing. The public comment period is open right now currently for this facility, and I will get to kind of when you need to submit by and where you submit in a minute. But you know, as you're thinking about writing a public comment, here are some takeaways from this presentation that you could incorporate. Also, please know that these takeaways are verbatim on our website, so please don't feel the need to rush and write any of this down. So that is publicly available for you to look at after, but just going through these really quickly. So the first takeaway is that these increased emissions, as Lisa discussed at length, can have extremely severe health impacts and add to those cumulative harms that already exist in Eugene and West Eugene and in these neighborhoods. And the primary neighbors that will be dealing with this are our neighbors in West Eugene. So it's just compounding already very bad air quality circumstances. The second takeaway point is around the issue of the PSELs. Even though it's legal, we would like to suggest that LRAPA should not allow such high generic PSELs, which are, again, the legal limits for the air toxic emissions. It would be great if LRAPA used the PTE as the highest limit, which reflects the new rules and the upcoming DEQ rulemaking. And for example, that would take down the volatile organic compounds from this facility from 39 to 1.1 tons per year. And that is a 37-ton difference. These numbers really matter. And the third takeaway point is that it is really important that PM10 and PM2.5 be kept at the 11 tons per year, the 11 tons per year potential to emit, and not the 14 tons per year PSEL. This is again harkening back to the prior point, but more specifically calling out the difference in particulate matter because those have such severe health impacts. Moving on to our fourth takeaway point, in terms of stack testing, right now the permit only currently requires testing every 5 years. We think it should be more than that. We recommend annual stack testing and requiring stack testing during full startup and full run scenarios. We need more data, basically. We need to know what's actually being emitted more than just, once every 5 years. And it's really important to call out the 5-year number because the Title V permits are for 5-year increments. So it would just be once during the duration of the entire permit. So we think that should be more. And the stack testing should reflect a worst case scenario when determining compliance. And our final point that we would like to suggest for a takeaway or for a public comment is that on the poor air quality days, when it's unhealthy for sensitive groups and the air quality index is over 101, we think that LRAPA should require that the cogen facility reduces production as a means of reducing particulate and other toxic air emissions in the airshed in order to benefit public health. Industrial users need to be held to the same standards that everyday people are held to when the air quality is that bad. Residents are asked to not use wood stoves or limit the times that they fill up gas, and it should not just be on individuals to take precautions and reduce emission activities during this time. So those are our takeaways. Again, they are on our website, so you can kind of take a second and look. And the last thing I will say is how you can comment, because we need your voice and your input is vital. So the comment deadline is Wednesday, July 7th. Oh my goodness. 27th, Wednesday, July 27th. The 7th has passed at 5 p.m. You can submit your written comments via email at permitting@lrapa.org, as well as through the snail mail. This information is also on our website, so that's available. It's also on the Seneca LRAPA public notice. It's on their sites as well, but if you just want something more streamlined, if you go to this event on our page, all of this information is there. And just a few quick things to just keep in mind is if you're planning on doing a physical mail-in copy, just be aware of how long things take in the mail. In order for your voice to be heard, it needs to be on a desk at LRAPA by 5 p.m. on the 27th. So if you can only mail things in, just keep that in mind. And when you send your emails, make sure you reference in the subject line the permit modification and renewal of Seneca Sustainable Energy's existing Title V operational air permit. Again, that is all on our website. So yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We have info@beyondtoxics.org, or you can call the number on the screen. And yeah, that's all we have for now.